Well, I'm back. My body and my brain are trying to figure out what's it supposed to be like to be on Central Daylight Savings Time. We crossed 8 time zones coming home, and that kind of it messes with me. But we're home, and it's gonna get better every day on the jet lag thing. So we're in 2 Timothy 2. I uh, I looked back at what I had done before I left, and realized, man, I just had uh, I was not real happy with what I watched. I just uh, so I'm going to try and do better. Okay. Um, First or 2 Timothy 2:3, uh, Paul's giving a word picture uh, that calls on people's experience in his day that we sometimes can't relate to. Join with me, he writes, in suffering like a good soldier of Christ Jesus. Then he goes on, and this kind of expands on and explains a little bit about what Paul would have meant when he said, uh, endure suffering like a good soldier of Jesus. No one serving as a soldier gets entangled in civilian affairs, but rather tries to please his commanding officer. Similarly, anyone who competes as an athlete does not receive the victor's crown except by competing according to the rules. The hardworking farmer should be the first to receive a share of the crops. Reflect on what I'm saying, for the Lord will give you insight into all this. Okay, man, here's a guy, he doesn't quite mix his metaphors, but he stacks them. First, he starts with the soldier. And in verse 4, he says, no one serving as a soldier gets entangled in civilian affairs. The reason for this is because if you're a soldier, especially if a soldier in Paul's day, this was your full-time occupation. You didn't, there was no Army or Air Force or Marine Reserves. If you were a soldier, you were a soldier. And that was where your main focus was supposed to be. The difficulty of getting entangled in civilian affairs, well, it goes in several directions. If number one, I'm entangled in civilian affairs in that I am dealing with things that don't relate to my status, my standing, my occupation as a soldier, is going to pull me off. It can and probably will pull me off task as a soldier. And that can make both me and anyone that I'm connected with in my unit, we will be more vulnerable if I have lost focus. Focus is huge for soldiering. You got to pay attention. So you don't get entangled in civilian affairs. It's interesting how things often entangle us. I don't set out to get entangled by anything, really. And yet I sometimes wake up and realize I'm entangled. The writer of Hebrews talks about the sin that so easily entangles us. And in that context, he's writing about runners and how, as a runner, you don't wear clothes that entangle you. You wear, you wear running clothes. Now, to be entangled in civilian affairs may mean something different for you than it does for me. But I think for all of us, I'll say it again, it comes back to we got to retain our focus. And then he says, instead of being entangled in civilian affairs, rather we try to please our commanding officer. Now, that's not in the kiss up kind of pleasing. What would please a commanding officer is that his troops obeyed his commands. And maybe to a degree that they would obey his commands with a cheerful heart and a willing spirit. And well, sure, but there are times when a command is a command for a difficult task, and it just can't be made pleasant. So our job as soldiers, good soldiers of Christ Jesus, is to obey his commands. That's what pleases him. Now, there's an aspect of this that I think we have to look more broadly to be able to connect the dots. And here's why I feel this way. If you're not careful, I think you could read into this that you please God by obeying him. So the whole point is to obey God. And I'm going to say that's not the whole point. That is an outcome of the actual point. So what is the actual point? Well, again, in the book of Hebrews, the writer says, without faith, it is impossible to please God. Because that's true, not if, but because it is impossible to please God without faith, then the thing that most pleases him is faith. The thing that most pleases our commanding officer is our trust. And out of our trust will come obedience. I think I don't want to make this like all boxy and, it's not as easy as this. But one of the ways I look at it is my ability to obey the commands of my commanding officer, Jesus, is directly related to the amount of faith. Or maybe another way to say it is to whether or not I engage my faith. Because to whatever degree I engage my faith, that's really as far as I'm going to be able to pull off this obedience thing. At the heart of that whole concept, I think, is grace. If we pull grace away from obedience, all we have is legalism. And if you want to see what Paul thought about legalistic living and approaching God, our relationship to God with legalism, read the book of Galatians. He doesn't stutter. He makes it very clear. This is not about you achieving your way through obedience into a strong, secure relationship with God. What sets us in that secure relationship is God's grace. And my job, my task, is to learn to accept, receive, live within, breathe deeply of His grace. This is the only way that I can please my commanding officer. Because as I am breathing deeply of God's grace, as I open my heart and my mind to God's grace, it is the power out of which I can obey. And it's the power for the faith that I can express and engage. Okay, I probably made it harder than it really needs to be, and I think I've made it less easy to understand, not more easy to understand, in verse 5. Similarly, now he changes the word picture. We got soldiers. Next, we've got athletes. Anyone who competes as an athlete does not receive the victor's crown except by competing according to the rules. Now, you know what? We live in an age where figuring out how do you get around the rules is a real big deal. And there are, in terms of professional sports and amateur sports, there will always be people who are trying to get around the rules. They don't want to think of themselves as cheaters, although really in the strictest terms, that's what they are. It should be, in my opinion, it should be that if you, in a competition, begin to work outside of the rules, to work around the rules, that should disqualify you. At the very least, there should be a penalty for a rules violation. Okay, that's a big hobby horse of mine, and I'll even go a little farther and say one of the reasons I love golf so much is because there is a book of rules, and it is codified, it is itemized, and the players are required to play within those rules. Oh, and by the way, they call infractions on themselves. Okay, just another thing about golf that makes it really a special kind of athletic effort and endeavor. Okay, anyone who competes as an athlete does not receive the victor's crown except by competing according to the rules. It's almost, I think, it's like Paul is saying, okay, there are rules for living your life as a good soldier of Christ Jesus, and as a competitor, which that is a little bit of an interesting thing, because there's some people that they hate the idea of competition. It's not about competing. It's about it's just about the experience. And I'm so tempted to dive into that a little bit, but I'm not going to, because I made a resolution. I'm gonna stay off bunny trails. Okay. You don't get the prize if you don't compete within the rules. Now, how does that work? What's the relationship there with Paul, where Paul started here in verse 3? Join with me in suffering like a good soldier. Well, I guess maybe the only thing I can think of is there are rules of soldiering. There are rules of athletic endeavor. And oh, by the way, there are rules. He goes on next to talk about farming. There are rules for farming. And if you try to do these things outside the rules, you can't be successful. You can't even be effective. So Paul is fond of military metaphors and athletic metaphors. He uses those pretty routinely in his letters. Kind of gives you maybe a little window into Paul's psyche. I think he talks about racing, running races. He talks about boxing. He talks about the generic athletic endeavor here. I think he may have been a sports fan. Okay. Verse 6. The hardworking farmer should be the first to receive a share of the crops. Now, okay, he's not talking about farming techniques. He's not talking, and I said there are rules of farming. You talk to any farmer and they'll tell you, yeah, there are rules of farming. You don't just indiscriminately, toss seed out anytime you feel like it and do whatever you feel like doing. There are seasons. There are things you have to do at certain times if you're going to have a harvest. But that's not what he's talking about. He's talking about a hardworking farmer should be the first to receive a share of the crops. It's like, he said this, I think it's in Galatians, you reap what you sow. In 1 Corinthians or 2 Corinthians, he talks about if you sow generously, you'll reap generously, but if you sow sparingly, you'll reap sparingly. And here, what's the point? It's not this is not the mechanics of farming. There should be benefit first to the farmer who works so hard. And you know what? I'm out of time, so we're going to come back to what does that mean for us when we get together next time on Soul Care with Stevie Boy.